Hi, everyone. Today we are talking about misconceptions around agility in HR. And when I say we, as you can see, it's Anja from Beek, who dials in from South Africa, and myself, Sarika Kharbanda. I'm dialing in from Pune in India. Hey there, Anja.
Good morning, everyone, or good day at least. And Sarika, what a lovely opportunity to collaborate again. I still remember when we met, what was it, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when we were authoring the book. And here we are still collaborating. And I know you're so passionate about Agile HR or the agility in the HR teams.
Yes, the book. You mentioned it. Yes, so for those who haven't really looked at our book, so yes, this is a book that Anja, myself, Pia, and we're a total of 36 co-authors, and I think it's a brilliant read. It's around Agile People Principles, your call to action for the future of work, where I've written about the principle of trust. How about you, Anja?
I wrote about the common direction and link it to the overall purpose of the organization and why it's critical for us to have that common direction, to know where we're going as teams. Sarika, I'm wondering, how did you end up in Agile HR? Is there a short story that you can share?
Well, I think there are lots of stories. But one key thing that does pop up in my mind, and I think maybe it's important to tell our audience that we've just created these questions right now. We aren't really scripting this whole talk, so that's interesting. One of my important stories was when I was doing an agile transformation in an organization. I remember the HR coming and saying, "Yeah, but we have to." Okay, but. Let me just roll that back a bit. When I was leading a transformation in an organization, and this was primarily on the IT side. And as we know, transformations generally start from the IT side, right? HR doesn't really lead from the front, which is why we're here. And we'll talk about that at some point somewhere. But here's what happened in that time frame, as I've been working with developers, testers, and, all of us need to have our KPIs at the time when I was working and not yet OKRs. But some of the KPIs of the developers and testers meant, hey, find as many defects as you can, testers. So obviously that meant they had to go against the developers and, developers probably not writing the right code. So let's find all the defects and, that obviously helps the testers get better on their KPIs, but goes away from the whole agile way of collaborating, where, going back to one of the principles that you talked about, that you wrote about, the common direction, the common purpose, agile in that context for this IT team has always been about what's our common goal, what's our common purpose. And the developers, testers, along with anybody else who's hands-on on the product is obviously, got a common goal to move towards. But the moment HR came and talked about these KPIs, obviously everyone was going to go in different directions, different purposes, right? My purpose is to find more defects. And the developer's like, oh my God, I'm going to make sure I write such good code that you can never find a defect. That's what led me to have a conversation, long story short, with HR, that I think we need to help you understand what does Agile mean to start with. Not even for you, but what does Agile mean? What is the team doing? And that's a very basic thing, because when you're doing, organization-wide transformations, we all need to be together on this, because we are all different parts of that moving system. And we are like, how can we all work together to be in that one common direction? That's my story.
Oh, that's amazing. And it's quite interesting because mine is actually coming from a different angle. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you can recall my last corporate role. I was head of HR, working for a multinational technology organization. And obviously the developers in the development team, they started to implement Agile and the Agile ways of working. And I am not very proud to say that I think I was sometime, or not me myself, but the department, the HR team, was sometimes the bottleneck to, create value for the customer. And the interesting part is I've never realized that when I was still in my role. And then when I started my own consulting business, my paths crossed with Pia Maria, and I attended one of her workshops. And that's when the penny dropped for me to understand that even though we had an amazing HR team and we did quite well as a business, I mean, we were best company to work for, so many other accolades that we were proud of. But when you think of being adaptable, being agile, nimble, and quick, we were not that. And I didn't even understand the different rhythms that the IT and development team had. And that I was, rolling out a new performance management system and not understanding why the developers are not on board. Yeah, so for me, that was, from that way. Since then, I'm absolutely passionate about supporting teams to become more agile. And I think that's why it's so important for the HR colleagues to understand, but what are some of the misconceptions? Because I was one of them a few years ago, not really understanding. But yeah, Sarika, perhaps from your view, when you work with your HR teams or the HR teams in your part of the world, what do you find? What are some of the misconceptions that you have come across?
That's a fantastic one, Anja. So I think just for our audience here, so what Anja and I just did before this call, and of course, I'm going to bring out more from my context or my perspective and my experience, and so is Anja going to get stuff out from her experience. But it's important. What we've done is that we've just taken a number of misconceptions and we prioritize them. We're like, what's the top 5 that we want to talk about today? So the topmost one that at least I've personally been hit with is this one. And I would love to hear your views on that too, Anja, see how you feel about that. And even with this first experience of mine with HR, the very first thing that comes out is Agile is for IT. It has nothing to do with HR. So just me saying that, I mean, maybe even before I share my perspective, how about I put that out to you? What do you feel about that? Does that resonate with you from your experience in the trenches? Tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what is quite interesting, over the last 2 weeks, I've done the Agile Leadership Program. And even in those programs, in those sessions, 1 or 2 of the delegates said exactly what you said. It's an eye-opening to see that agility, or the agile ways of working, can be used and implemented in a non-technology space. And I'm thinking not only HR, but I mean someone from marketing or someone from sales, but specifically then for today to think, yes, that agility is possible in an agile space. So absolutely, I've seen that one as well.
No, I love the fact that you brought in marketing. And I think it's great that we can get this also to our audience, because you and I both coach a lot in non-IT spaces. And it's really, we talk about functional agility. So when I'm working with marketing teams or when I'm working with HR teams, I mean, a simple agile value, like, if you just pick up customer collaboration over contract negotiation, that's coming directly from the Agile Manifesto, which, these amazing 17 gurus put together. And if I just look at that value, all we are saying is if you just look at customer collaboration for HR, the customers could be internal to HR themselves, or it could be the rest of the organization, or it could be the business people, or it could be the vendors they're dealing with, So I think that's the context. And if I'm looking at marketing, it could be something similar. It could be their own internal customers or their external customers, their content consumers or other people they work with for their campaigns. So I would personally just say, if we could just absorb the fact that context matters, just take your context, take the Agile Manifesto and take these Agile People Principles that you've got here. And I think it's a wonderful mix of this that we can bring to life by embracing that Agile is really not just for IT, it could be for anybody. The second one, sorry, go on.
No, I said absolutely. And I think, what was the second one that you wanted to touch on? Because I think it links perhaps to the one that comes to mind for me when we think about Agile, is more about the mindset
Yes.
and not so much the practices and the tools that you use.
Spot on, because it is not just about, how do we say that? It's not about the doing, it's about the being of Agile. I mean, people might say, yeah, these are just jargons, right? But no, they're not jargons. This is a practical way to doing things. Now, I could, of course, if I had to do Agile, I could just say, hey, HR, yes, you need to work in iterations from tomorrow. You need to do retrospectives every 2 weeks. That's doing Agile. Great. You've been doing daily stand-ups. Okay. But are you being Agile? So my thinking will be, have you really taken the Agile values and principles and have you started imbibing them in your mindset, in your DNA, in your day-to-day working? So are you applying those rather than just checking the box and just doing them, right? There's a difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really one of the delegates yesterday, when I asked about the nuggets for them, she said exactly that I've never thought of Agile as a way of thinking. How does my behavior influence the way that I'm showing up in meetings, when we disagree, when we collaborate, when we're trying to solve problems? And she was quite surprised to hear that there's values and that there's principles. And I'm so proud to say that we actually have the Agile People Principles. So it's really focusing on the people side of the business and almost building on what the technology colleagues did way back when. So yeah, she was quite surprised to think that if I use the Kanban board just as an example, or Trello, when I do recruitment, yeah, I might be using one of the tools, but I'm not really being Agile when I'm not open to suggestions or to changes when I'm already in the recruitment process. And I think that is when the magic starts to happen, when you understand, as you said, it's not about the practices or the tools, it's really applying the principles each and every day. And for me, it even goes one step further to think, but what new habits are you creating now that you're aware of these principles? How do you change your behavior in small things, in the course of your operations?
Exactly. And that then becomes the inherent part of our DNA, doesn't it? Because those habits then just form us. But it takes a while. We're not saying it's overnight.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's perhaps something when you say it doesn't happen overnight, what comes to mind for me as well is that whole concept of, if you think of the 4 values of Agile, where we say, if you think of the modern Agile, safety, that makes safety a prerequisite. And there they speak specifically about psychological safety. And then you start to look at what's the environment that we create? How do we, what is that place of, I almost want to say, psychological safety? Have you heard any misconceptions around psychological safety and that value specifically?
To be honest, no, not in my experience, nothing specifically about psychological safety, but it I think still goes down to people thinking about it's definitely not, it doesn't feel safe to people to do it. It reflects in their nature. It reflects in the environment that they are in. So even though they don't talk specifically about it, I've seen that come out in their behavior, in their actions, in their words, and that speaks much louder for me. So would anyone have raised it in my experience specifically like the way you put it? Definitely no. But was it there, existent? For sure it was. But I know you shared, you heard too much about this, so tell us.
Yeah, so I would love to share this one because I think it's so important, and it's one of the clients that has already started implementing Agile. Obviously, their technology part of the business is already very, I want to say, they've embedded those values and principles and ways of working, and it's now going over to other parts of the business. You know what was interesting about what she said? When we spoke about that whole concept of psychological safety, she said it's so important to understand the balance. Because often when we use the term psychological safety, many people think it's about creating a warm and fuzzy and everyone gets along type of culture. And it's actually the opposite. It's really creating a culture where we feel comfortable to take risks, but also when we speak up, we do hold one another accountable. So it's that balance of, yes, let's create the safety, but let's still hold one another accountable. And I think that was such an important part, and something that she mentioned very specifically, that when they started to build this culture, one thing that they recognize and a misconception for them to get out of the way. And I think that was quite a good one to mention to the audience.
No, I like the fact that this was very explicit in your experience where, they've come up by saying this. For me, most of the time, like I shared, it's been very hidden. And I think that itself says a lot, right? Because it shows that they don't feel safe to even speak up. And that's where the culture tells you a lot about the culture. But again, it's never been explicit. And I've always had to pull this out in conversations and then talk about, hey, so if the environment doesn't allow you to do this, what can we change as leaders, as management, for the people? And sometimes I would say, Anja, it's also for the management themselves, where they don't feel safe, but they don't really talk about it. And I think it's unfortunate that we don't think about the fact that psychological safety is also for the leadership or management. It's not just for teams and the rest of the organization, but it's also for people who have to enable that environment, right? And I'm fully resonant there with you that, yeah, it's probably one other misconception. And I don't know how far Agile HR teams that you've worked with or HR teams that you've worked with feel safe themselves to be able to go out and, implement or build the kind of culture we're talking about. Which?
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just to comment on that one, because it's a journey. And I think because with that specific environment, it does not happen overnight. I mean, if we talk about creating that culture, we know that culture change takes some time. But yeah, sorry, I was interrupting you there.
No. So I was just saying, which also brings me to the other misconception. Actually, I was just moving on just to the next one because it felt so linked, where we talk about a lot of no structure in the Agile world, right? And that's one very common misconception that I've heard, that, oh, it's so unstructured, it's so chaotic, it doesn't go well with, we have complete documentation. We go step 1, step 2, step 3. And I'm like, that's an interesting one. But who said it was unstructured? Who said there was no documentation? Even the Agile values say, over comprehensive documentation, but nobody is saying that that's ignored. We're not saying don't have documentation. It's always working software over comprehensive documentation. I mean, if you take that context and, apply, if you take that value and apply it to your own context, it'll tell you a lot. But here's the thing. It's how much do you want documented? How much of structure do you want? What's your perspective about structure? Now, I could be very comfortable if there was, just enough planning or just working with bullet points. For example, even if I had to talk through this conversation, we could just put bullet points and I'm good with that, but not everybody could be, right? So you've got to understand what the whole team really, gets aligned with. So if it is some level of documentation and that works for you as a team, great, do that. That's the structure you need. If I don't know, the structure of the organization itself is what structure means to people, then maybe that's what one should look into. Or if it is just a perspective that Agile is about zero documentation and nothing else, then okay, that's a real big misconception, because I think Agile can, and I don't think it's about, that leads us to the next misconception, but we'll hold on to that because this is so buzzy and so jargony at the end of it. But just staying right now in this specific misconception, I would say if people are congruent to the values and principles of the Agile Manifesto, I think there is so much beautiful structure you can build around everything, even for planning, starting all the way from daily planning to, I don't know, top level strategic planning and whatever levels of planning you want to create on the way, daily, weekly, monthly, fortnightly, and so on. There's so much structure that one can have about it. And it's weird that we would want to say no structure, but okay. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think that is why that getting a little bit of knowledge and understanding what the whole purpose, I almost want to say behind the manifesto was, and why they've implemented it in the first place. And I mean, in the end, it's all about the value to the customer. And I think that's something that I have seen, is that what works for one team might be totally the opposite for another team. But I think, getting back to that misconception about unstructured, I've actually seen the best agile teams being very disciplined, very specific, as you said, in how we work together, how do we report back, how do we show what we've done so far. So definitely being unstructured, I think, is a big misconception.
Which then leads us to the very last misconception, which is agile is just a buzzword. I kind of agree with that misconception, okay? So I think you and I have had at-length conversations about it, but that's not just it. So most of the times we hear from HR, agile is just a buzzword, so we shouldn't even be talking about it and so on. And I think to a large extent, they are right about that. And most of the transformations or moving people in a business from being agile at one point to another, most of the transformations that I would have done, I barely remember using the word agile or any jargon associated with it. So this is, I think, one misconception that I would kind of agree with, that it is a jargon. It is a more, how do you put it in a polite way? It's a very abused word. So try not to use it unless very necessary, because my experience definitely tells me once people see the value of what is happening, once they start seeing it, once the team start feeling the value of, why we're all doing what we're doing, they then definitely want to ask you, hey, does this have a name? And then, yes, I have always told them, oh, there is something from the agile world that we are trying to implement here, whether it's in the context of change, whether it's in the context of HR, marketing. I've at least had that experience. So for me, it's a good misconception and I will align with it. Don't use this word. But okay, over to you, Anja.
Yeah, and I think I'm smiling as you're talking, because especially if you think of the last few years, words like being adaptive, being responsive, I mean, perhaps they're overused. And as you say, for some people, agile is a swear word, yeah? But I think the misconception comes in that when you think of agility as something that's just another nice to have, it's just another fly by night, I think that's the misconception, because it's all about, as you've highlighted, the narrative that we use. We can be agile or have agility in our teams, and we don't even necessarily call it that. So yeah, I think, like you said, it's a misconception because it's an overused word. But yeah, I think it's a good point to end the conversation for today.
I agree. And yeah, I hope our listeners and viewers, if you've heard of more agile HR misconceptions, like Anja and I shared at the beginning of this video, we had a whole list and we thought these top 5 were good to have a short conversation on today and, just bring this out openly to you and see what you have to say. But if you would like to have a chat with us on these misconceptions too, I think both of us keep having open coffee chats, so do watch out on our LinkedIn space. The link is also there below. You can connect with us. And yeah, we would love to hear what misconceptions in the HR or even marketing world have you been hearing about. The interesting jargon word called agile for now. We'll leave it at that. And thank you so much, Anja. It's been a very lovely conversation as always.
Yeah, thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to connecting to some of our listeners. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.